Hi, today we're going to talk to Ben House and look at the way that he created this future bass track using his Jammy G. Hey Ben.
Hello, everybody. My name is, as Marco was saying, my name is Ben House, and I'm a producer in the New York metropolitan area. And today I'm going to be walking you through the future bass track, which is actually yet to be named, but it is the future bass track I made for the August Jammy Challenge.
All right, so this is the project for that track.
Yes, that
It's
is
called
correct.
Jammy Challenge.
It is called Jammy Challenge at the moment. It has yet to have an official name, but
All
for
right.
now, I think Jammy Challenge is sufficient.
Should we ask the viewers to submit their ideas for the name in the comments?
Why not? I love that. So.
Yeah, let's do that. So can you share like the backstory of how you came up with the idea and what you started with?
The whole idea started when I was messing around with a patch in Serum combined with this really cool plugin called Fin Micro. You can see here in the project file that I actually have this little intro portion, which is actually unused in the final product. But this is kind of, I guess you could say, my brainstorming scratch idea kind of area. So the whole track started out with just this one key sound while I was messing around with that Finisher Micro plugin, which is really cool, adds some nice high-end shimmer on things. It's basically like the preset I'm using is a combined delay and pitch shifter and everything, so it adds a bunch of cool sparkle. So when I play, instead of sounding really dry and boring like this, if I turn that and a nice big reverb on, it sounds like this. Which, played the wrong chord, but there we go. That's with the right chord. And you can see it sounds a lot more nicer and happier. But I was kind of messing around with that, and I just came up with this chord progression. The whole thing just started out with the root chord, and then the minor 4 chord, both in inversions. I think they sound great because the minor 4 chord just sounds great and everything. I wanted to go a little further off of that, so I kind of just experimented a bit. And then went back. Then an inversion. Back here. Back to the minor 4, and back to the root. That was the initial idea, and I kind of combined that with the fancy lead here, and I added a couple other sounds, and this demo is going to sound very bad and very unbaked because it was a demo, but just to show you my actual scratch process, this is what the original demo sounded like when I just had the chords and an initial idea.
Sweet.
Yeah, that was just the initial idea. I kind of just went off of a couple of things I really liked on that. So I didn't end up actually using the sparkly lead, but the idea of the moving bass line and the kind of synth pad that was controlled by the accelerometer on Jammy, or at least the filter was controlled by that, was kind of what I brought into the actual final track.
Ah, I see. So that's the actual like final track down there below.
Yes, the actual final track is right here.
What was the name the next thing after like the chord progression that you added? So first thing was the keys, right? And then what was the next one? Did you go to the straight to the beat, to the drums, or?
Good question. I think I went right to the drums because I was trying to get like a feel for rhythm before I kind of created the bass to that. So I just kind of laid down the drums here. I might have even I don't know if I don't remember if I played these in on Jammy, or I also have a launch pad which I have played things in every once in a while. So I might have played it in on there. Most likely though, I'm pretty sure I just entered this by hand. And then I kind of just figured out the bass after that. This one I obviously played in by hand because I would never want to program all these little
Yeah.
notes by hand. I did those. Those are just slides on the Jammy. So
It's running through Serum, right? Is that the
yeah,
bass sound
this
coming from Serum? Yeah. But
yeah this
I
bass.
really
Mhm.
love those glides that you have there. Also, there's that mono, the voicing section. Is that where you control whether this stuff will be legato, or like whether it'll sound as glides or as individual notes? Or is it just
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, if you want to create those kind of glide effects, this is where that whole all that stuff is adjusted in Serum. And even if you're just using a free synthesizer, it will be the same kind of ideas because almost every single polyphonic synthesizer you have, whether it's free or premium, will have the option to have a mono option, which is essentially you can only play one note at a time for those who don't know. And then there's also legato, which in this case, you can read the exact description it gives. It determines whether or not envelopes for LFOs set or any of those stuff will re-trigger if a second note is played, which
Mhm.
honestly, I don't think that's actually doing much in this case. It's mostly just the mono that's doing something. And then the main control you want to worry about is this right here, the portamento, because that's going to adjust like how long the slide takes to happen. So whenever you have mono mode on, let me just tilt my camera back down for a second. Whenever you have mono mode on, if you play two notes consecutively, actually, let me just enable the bass real quick. Okay. If you just play two notes consecutively, but they're not like tied together, they're going to be played as separate notes. But if you start playing one of the other notes while the other note is still playing like this, you hear there's a little bit of a slide there, and I can adjust the portamento to just how much that happens. So right now it's at around 30 milliseconds. I can drag that up, and if I make that long, suddenly it's going to be much longer. But for a subtle effect, I just kept it down to that 20 or 20 to 30 milliseconds.
Mhm.
But
Yeah,
like I
and
said,
you
it's just
have
a really fun thing.
a pretty fast slide there, so you don't want it to last forever. But yeah,
Exactly. Just little slides, things like that, the tiny details really help make a track just come alive. So
yeah. And so, actually, is there any like theory or like any specific approach behind that bass line?
yeah, the longest note in the bass is usually the root, or if it's not the root, it's kind of what is acting as the root in this case. So if it's the inversion of the chord, it will be the root note of that inversion. So here, for example, it's playing the root note. And here I actually kind of arpeggiated up because this is the root note here. Let me find it. This note, that's the root, but I kind of arpeggiated up the chord. So the note I held the longest is actually the fifth of that second chord. And then here, it does the exact same thing. When we get to here, and there I'm also, even if these, because I was kind of playing inversions as I went along down, and this flowing bass line was what the lowest note I was playing on the jammy was when I was playing the actual chord progression. Because if you remember, when I was playing that, there was a walking bass line on the A string.
Yeah,
So that bass line is exactly what the actual bass is following, which
cool.
it might not necessarily be the root note of the chord, but it's the lowest note that's currently being played.
Mhm.
So in terms of like the theory for the little fills and stuff, to be honest, I wasn't quite thinking about theory, though if you were to analyze it, you could say I was kind of just following general guidelines of arpeggiating the chords, sometimes adding, say, like a second or fourth notes that wouldn't normally be in the chord, but kind of just went to them temporarily to kind of spice things up a bit instead of just being a normal arpeggio.
Yeah. And actually, like last thing about like the bass sound is, so this is the one that you used for the draft. Did you end up changing it later? And like when you were drafting, did you just select a preset that you liked and then tweaked it a little bit, or what's your usual approach?
Good question, especially because my approach is very mixed in a lot of scenarios, depending on how fast I'm trying to work and if I have a certain sound in mind, depends on whether I will actually go in and physically make a preset or if I will just first search through my entire library of presets and find something. But this one appears to have been a preset that I made. I think I was just messing around in this case. Yeah, because there's obviously no natural progression to this effects right here. I just kind of added things on and just processed them as I went along, kind of just designing a sound. I mean, I don't really know how to describe the sound design process other than just experimentation. Mess with knobs until you know what you want or until you find something you like.
So
Which
do you do that
there
in
is.
the process of like adding the bass line, or do you first like hear the bass line that you want to create, and like, so which comes first, like the notes or the sound in this?
Usually, usually the notes would come first for me because I usually find that that's the most important, and then I'll design a sound to fit those notes. So usually when I'm recording, it will just be, say, like a plain sawtooth waveform, like when you initially load up Serum. That's what I'll record with. I might adjust the portamento or things like that if I want to, like definitely have the slide be a defining characteristic of the sound, but anything else is just not there. I design it afterwards because I guess I place notes paramount. I give them the most paramount importance in this case. And then you also asked if I changed my bass sound design,
Yeah.
which I don't remember. So let's check that out real quick. Yes, it looks like I did create a completely different bass for this one. I distorted it a little differently with a sine shaper instead, just a chorus. Looks like it was just a sine wave or a sawtooth waveform, and then whatever this waveform is, one of Serum's built-in wavetables. I guess it's the 4088 in this case, and I add some noise. That's kind of the key to this sound, I think, is that noise, because let me just record and enable this real quick. If you don't have the noise on, and you play, if you don't have it on, it kind of loses all of that high-end energy that you get with it. It loses its hype, I guess you could say. So if you want to really add that hype in, just add noise. It's really that simple. Just make sure it's not overpowering the actual bass, because you can see the level's lower than it would be by default. And I'm also sending this directly to the output of Serum, so it's not going through any of this distortion or chorus, because if it was, it's not going to sound pretty. Like, this is what it would sound like with that. It just kind of dirties up the sound, which if you want that, it's great, but I just kind of wanted clean hype energy. So, and outside of that, it looks like the only processing I did was I added an EQ, which is just high passing. Everything below it looks about to be 200 or 300 hertz, mostly just to leave room for the sub bass right here. I'm boosting a little bit in that 200 to 1K range, just to kind of add a little more fullness to the sound. And I'm also high passing it. I'm low passing it in this case, because I'm cutting some of the highs just to make sure that it doesn't take up too much of that high frequency space that other sounds are taking. Like if I were to play without any of this EQ on, it sounds like this. And then I turn it on. The change is subtle, but it's still there. And in terms of the mix, it makes a big difference.
Mm-hmm. Cool. I want to go back to the initial idea and just hear every layer of what you started with before we like dive into how that then transformed. There's the leads, the keys part, which was first. Then you said the next one was the drums. Let's quickly just, is it like a common future-based pattern, or did you just program it in by like how you felt it?
Yeah, I think I just programmed it in how I was thinking, really. I was not originally thinking future bass for this. When I was doing this initial idea, I was kind of just thinking a kind of stadium pop track almost, I guess you could say. So I literally searched on Splice for stadium drums, and I used a Kashmir Stadium drum pack, and I just played this in, I guess. Or I don't remember if I played it in or if I hand drew it in, but I guess I was just originally thinking stadium drums, like. And so that's kind of how it fit in.
So it's basically just that, just
yeah.
the kick and a snare, and that's it?
Yeah, that's all it is. Really simple, just a kick and a snare. I have a couple other samples here because I was experimenting with them, but I didn't use any of them because I didn't feel like it needed it. So
yeah, and so other than that, there's 2 more tracks here in the initial idea. There's a silent and another Serum pads, or is that?
yeah, this is just another key instrument that I recorded after the initial kind of main key patch. This is just, yeah. So it is kind of acting like a pad. This one is a preset because I was going faster at this point. So this is from Zach's Splice pack, Serum Voices of Light, if you want to get this exact preset. Just a little pad to kind of fill it out. And then underneath here is probably another pad as well. Yeah. Oh, sorry. This is the big sweeping filter synth. And it looks like, yes, I linked the mod wheel of Silent to the accelerometer on Jammy when I was recording this. And I was kind of just having fun with that. Yeah, and that looks like it's all there is to the sound. The sound is just a saw wave, or a super saw in this case, which if you don't know how to do, you just turn the voices up on the sawtooth waveforms, you detune it a bit. Looks like I also put some compression, or some chorus, EQ, and a bit of reverb on. And to get that filter sound, I just low passed it, and once again, I linked the cutoff of the filter to the mod wheel on the synthesizer.
Cool.
And yeah, that is all the elements of the preliminary idea I had for the track.
Can we run it again?
Yeah. So just to play it back one more time.
Nice. And so what comes next?
What comes next was I kind of sat on this for a couple days because I wasn't very happy with it and I was trying to figure out where to go with it. And then I just had the idea, what if future bass? That was quite literally the idea. Like, what if I made this future bass? So I think the next thing I recorded, if I remember correctly, was these main synth pads, or the main synth parts. The actual patch just started out like this. Or this is what it sounds like in the end. I'll break down how I made it. But yeah, I kind of just started off with that. That's the end sound design process, but I started off with that general idea of like super saw layers because I was going for future bass. So that was the very first thing that came to mind. As for how I actually designed those patches, they're all slightly different sawtooth waves, they're all slightly different super saw waveforms, or super saw synths in this case. So here's the first one. Next one's basically an octave up if I remember correctly. Yeah. Slightly more detuned an octave up, and then this one, basically the same thing, an octave up from the previous one, and even more detuned, and this one is an arpeggio, I think? Yeah. This one's just being arpeggiated up and down, as you can see right here. That one is a little bit different sound design. That is Still a sawtooth mostly, and then whatever this weird waveform is, one of Ableton's default ones, the BSOD underscore square. Then I added some hyper and dimension, delay, reverb, just to kind of fill it out, give it a little more like funness, I guess you could say, in this case.
So
As for how I,
with those sawtooth sounds, did you did you transpose them before they ran into Serum, or is it like were you doing that inside the Serum when you were designing the sound of Serum, or
good
did you
question.
just transpose the MIDI notes?
It's quite possible I just transposed the MIDI notes, which, yeah, by the looks of it, that is what I did. Because, yeah, if I go in, yeah, this one's around here. This one is around an octave lower. Yeah, so I literally just went in and transposed the MIDI notes.
Mm-hmm.
It does exactly the same thing to do it in the synthesizer itself. It's just two different ways to do the same activity. As for how I actually designed all the cool, fancy stuff in these fun synths, it's started as, let me just, actually something I'm going to do is I'm going to remap the filter cutoff to the whammy bar, or the accelerometer on Jammy, just so I can demonstrate. So just map it there like that. So now I can control the cutoff. So if I play something, sorry, I had the wrong sound enabled there. Let me re-enable it. Okay, if I play, you can hear the filter cutoff. You can see right now the macro is for the, so essentially how I mapped this out is I created a macro on Serum that is adjusting that kind of LFO that's doing all the fancy volume stuff. So all the
It's
chugging
kind of
stuff
like
you hear.
the tremolo stuff, right? Where it's like
Exactly.
mhm.
The tremolo effect. Like here. That's being controlled by macro 1. This part I did actually just automate it in after I recorded because I wanted to be super precise.
Mm-hmm.
But
Can you
if you
show
just
the
wanted to,
automation? Because I'm trying to wrap my head around like how
yeah.
that is, it like a 2 times speed up or something?
Yeah, so I think it's quite literally just it's this straight line, but it's, if I check out the mapping in Serum, the macro 1 is assigned to the rate of LFO2. And LFO2 is currently modulating the amplitude of the entire synth, which you can follow along with exactly what I said right here. So macro 1 is adjusting the LFO2 rate. LFO2 is adjusting the amplitude of the entire synth. So by transitive effect in that case, if I adjust the macro 1 knob, it's going to adjust the rate of the LFO and thus the kind of rate of the tremolo effect.
It feels like it's not like a gradual change in the rate. It feels like a more sort of so is the LFO2 rate, does it go like a quarter note, an eighth note, a 16th note, a 32nd note, or
Yeah, essentially it does that because the great thing about Serum is you can adjust the LFO rate depending on a couple different factors. So when by default, it's just going to do exactly that. So when you turn, as you see, when I turn this knob, it goes by certain step values. It's almost acting like a step function, if you will. Like it's just kind of quantizing to these different values. So if I turn it up, it's not going to go continuously from 1/8 to 1/16. It's going to go right between them. If I did want to make it continuous, I would have to switch to a different mode, which yeah, you just turn BPM off here. And that's going to do it based on hertz, which is how a lot of other LFOs and other synths will do it, in which case it will be continuous. It would sound like this. So that's without the BPM on. With the BPM on, so it is a big difference in this case because, like you said, one is quantized, the other is not. The other is continuous throughout.
and it's really cool that it sticks on the beat because it adds that like I was surprised that there's no like, is there still no hi-hats or anything in the mix? Because basically like this rhythmic effect is serving as that sort of hi-hats or
Yeah. I'm pretty sure there isn't any hi-hats. Let me double check that. I did add a bunch of percussion later on here.
Mm-hmm.
So let's solo this and just listen to it. So there is some hi-hats here. So it looks like that's a shaker, or whatever this percussion sound is, a shaker, and then two hats on top of each other. But it's also really low in the mix, so you don't really hear it too much, like when you combine it with the rest of the drums. It's adding a little bit of hype, so it is doing something, but a lot of that main rhythmic function is not coming from the hats, but from the synths themselves.
Yeah. That's what I was trying to say. And let's go back into that automation, because there's another automation there, right? There's not just the tremolo effect that's automated, but there's also that slide at the end. Or is it a slide, or what is it?
That is a slide. So it's essentially just me. I mapped the master tuning of Serum as well as the wetness of a reverb. This was kind of like the little fun thing I threw in. So the macro too, when I turn it up, is essentially it pitches down all of Serum continuously. So it kind of acts like using the pitch wheel on Serum in this case, but I wanted it to like automate it. And for some reason, when I thought about doing that, I mapped it to macro too, which honestly, you could just do pitch bend there and it would do the exact same thing, but I did it this way. And, but the other benefit about using a macro is that I could also map macro to the wetness of this reverb. So that kind of essentially when it goes down, it also creates this big reverb sound. So let me just, it's probably easier if I play it without the reverb and then with, for you to understand it. So, because it's very hard to explain how it works without just hearing it. So if I play it without the reverb, it's kind of just okay. But then when you turn the reverb on, you hear how it kind of has that little extra space at the end. It's a very subtle detail, but I kind of put it there for my own pleasure because I knew I was going to recognize that it's there and it sounds a little better. So yeah, that was the other automation. And the last automation was the one I recorded with the whammy bar. That is the filter cutoff. So when I played, it was, yeah, it won't sound like it did right now because the macros aren't mapped to the whammy bar. But if I wanted to, I could map the cutoff or the tremolo thing as well to the whammy bar. So if I move it now and I set the minimum value to say such and such, now if I play, it's all being controlled by the accelerometer on whammy or on jammy, the accelerometer on jammy.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the way you can do it so that everything's being controlled live. But I wanted something extremely quantized, so I added that in post. But
anything that changed with the chord progression, or is it basically the same kind of automation on every chord, even when the B section kicks in?
So the B section, it does change up a bit. So basically now the change is only happening at the end of every bar, or if I was doing it in a double time project, it would be every 2 bars, at the end of every 2 bars that this pitch automation is happening now. The cutoff of the filter seems to generally still be following the main chord, as in like there's a peak within the chord itself. And as for macro 1, it looks like, yeah, it's just doing the same thing. So every single major chord is re-triggering the, I guess you call it the manual LFO or the LFO adjustment in this case. So
cool.
That is all that changes in the B section. Same general ideas. It's just that essentially the pitch bending happens less often.
Yeah. What would you say came next?
I would say next, most likely, came the bass because I wanted to create a full sound first. So I think the first thing I came to was here, this bass sound, which I kind of went over a little bit before, but Also, oh yeah, by the way, when I was performing this live, I had a pitch shifter on, but when I was doing it in post, I turned it off because that's just how it ended up working. So this is how it should sound. Like I said before, I went through the sound design. Just pretty simple, actually, just distortion chorus, these oscillators. The noise is kind of the key, an EQ, which I talked about. And then these compressors are really just sidechain compressors. So one is for the kick and one is for the snare.
Did you end up switching between different like sensitivity or playability presets on the jammy when you were messing when you were recording these different parts, or was it more or less recorded on the same settings?
Really good question. I don't remember specifically, but if I were to do it now, most likely I would have gone to one of the basic presets for when recording the one of the presets that didn't have, say, pitch bend or like sliding enabled when I was recording the block chords, just decrease the possibility or chance of the of any like off notes being triggered or any accidental notes being triggered, just so I wouldn't have to go back and edit it. As for this one, I think I was just on my default preset, which is essentially I had a couple of the velocity adjustments specifically for my the way I play. So in terms of like the picking velocity or the picking sensitivity in that case, those settings were kind of custom tailored to how I pick and things like that.
Got it.
So, which to be honest, I kind of just came up with that preset by, like I said, going to the default preset and adjusting things until I could play and I could make it feel the most natural. So,
Sweet. Got it. Got it. Did you
Mhm.
put in the drums as you were preparing to work on this section, or did you start with the synths first and foremost, and then like bass and then drums? Or
Yeah, I basically did the chords and then I figured out the general idea for the bass and then I added the drums, which, if I remember correctly, was just the kick and snare first. So the kick is just one layer.
Mhm.
This kick, don't know what it is, just a kick. The snares are looks like it's three snares layered. This is a cool tip. I don't know if I actually executed this. I'm pretty sure I did. But one cool tip you can do is if you have three snares that say just start right on the beat and you want to kind of give it a thicker sound, this is a tip that Son Holo gave in one of his master classes, is that just shift the snare slightly off beat, either before or after, if you have multiple snares layered, and it will kind of create this more thick sound effect in that respect. So if I were to play it as if I lined it up perfectly, for example, like this, and I remove the tail, it's kind of just okay. But then back to where it was, you hear how it kind of adds that extra thickness to it. So it really hits harder. So that's a really cool tip I wanted to pass along. Credits to Son Holo on that one.
Sweet. And so when you as soon as you move from that initial idea over to the final production, do you break it up into separate kick, snares, channels straight away? Yeah, when you're looking for the different sounds.
Yeah. So when I was making this, I think I was actually making it in a drum rack, which I ended up deleting and pasting all the parts in here just so I could process them individually. But when I was recording it, I was doing so. I was kind of just adding everything to an Ableton drum rack, kind of how it is over here. So the way I do things is I just drag in the samples from Splice and I'll just mess around with playing different ones, seeing which ones I like best, seeing which combinations work best. And then once I find a sound I like, as I did in this case, I kind of played it in, and then I would later go and just reprogram everything in manually with the audio waveforms so I could process them individually and just you can process them individually using the drum rack, but for my own head sake, I like doing it in here and grouping them like this. So,
Got it. Cool. Cool.
mhm.
So okay, we got the synths, the main keys. We got the bass, and we got the drums. What's next?
To be honest, there's not quite much else left in the project. There's the hats that we talked about here. There's some, this is actually a pretty important aspect of it, the drop sound effects, because without it, these kind of help maintain all the energy and transition between the different areas of the drop. So this is what it sounds like on its own.
Oh yeah. You know, it's cool. Like, you know, when you're listening to it in the mix, you don't know exactly what's creating it. And then the reason I love these breakdowns of tracks is that now I get to recognize what it was that created that like feeling of anticipation of that next kick.
Yeah, exactly. And that's just these
Oh, it's actually the anticipation
cashmere
of a
sweeps.
snare, right? It's like, ooh.
Yeah, although there is some effects going into the expectation of the kick, like this sweep right here. This really short sweep is anticipating the kick, and these big drops are anticipating the snares. So it's kind of just using sweeps to your advantage to give the big hits of either kick drums or snare drums more energy in this case. Yeah, and the actual sounds I use, just a sub dropped from Kashmir paired with a couple sweeps from Kashmir. This is all almost all of it is Kashmir, if not all of it. So if you're looking for a good sample pack to get from Splice, Kashmir FX are great. I highly recommend them. And then just this impact, and then yeah, just a sweep down. So combine all of that and you get this. Which when you listen to the context without that and then with it, you'll notice a pretty big difference. So without it, now with it, it kind of just fills out that missing space that was there before. It kind of transitions between the little mini sections, and it gives more anticipation to the big beats.
Mm-hmm. And then there's the solo, right?
Yes, the solo is the last important aspect. There's a couple crash cymbals here, and this is just the audio that my microphone's currently going through. But if we go here, this is the last important part. This is the lead solo synth. So let me just make sure nothing else is record enabled so I can play that for you guys. Here we go. So this sound is literally pretty quiet for me right now. That's what it is. But if I look into what I did, I have a sub, which isn't turned on going to the direct out, so that's completely useless, so you don't need to worry about that. But in terms of the actual sound design, it looks like I have an LFO going to the wavetable position of oscillator A, which is just creating some subtle movement. This preset is just one of their preset waves. The stub you saw has unison, a little bit of detune, combined with oscillator B, which is just a detuned saw wave with multiple voices. So without that, it sounds like this. With it, sounds like this. Almost the same, but subtle, very subtle difference. I also have some distortion by the looks of it, sine shaper, hyperdimension, and a filter. So without the filter, it sounds like this. Kind of harsh. Without any of these, it sounds like this. Kind of plain. Distortion adds a bit of grit. The hyperdimension kind of gives it a bit of space and width. And the filter kind of softens the sound. And if I am correct, I did map... Yes, because I wanted to filter after the distortion. So something to keep in mind whenever you're using Serum is that the filter here is applied before any of these effects. So if you want to apply a filter after any of these effects are applied, you need to apply it in a filter in the effects page. So that's what I did. And I mapped that to macro 1. And if I'm correct, I mapped macro 1 to the accelerometer on Jammy. So if I go like that, then should be able to play now. Yeah, just subtle little things, but That's kind of what created movement. And I basically just recorded a couple takes of me just improvising over this. I think I was just thinking slight variations on the arpeggios and on the pentatonic scale in this case. I was kind of just messing around, having fun. And I recorded a couple takes. This is the one I liked the best. So it just ended up sounding like this.
Sweet.
And those bends, this is one of the things I really love about Jammy, is that when you bend, it will actually like pitch bend up and down. So I was really messing around with that here and having a lot of fun with that, especially on this note, because you see it stays on the same note. But you hear that pitch bend up, almost like a guitar, because that's how it was played in a guitar style. So yeah, just having fun there. That's basically it.
Sweet. I really love those little like slides that you did there and how they sound on this synth.
Here. Yeah. Slides, I wouldn't expect them to work well with synthesizers when translating from a guitar playing standpoint, but they tend to translate surprisingly well, especially when you have some reverb on to kind of carry it over.
Yeah, so. Yeah, and the glide in the synth.
Yeah, all that really helps. Which, if I go back, it looks like, yes, I also still have mono mode if you want to. I generally recommend that if you're playing a lead sound, enable mono mode. It will make your life easier when you're playing it, and it can also make life a lot more fun if you want to do that portamento stuff. That's what enabling mono mode enables you to do. So anytime you're not playing chords, anytime you're playing lead sounds or bass sounds, I recommend you enable that. It just makes everything a lot more fun.
And then when you had all of this done, can you quickly run us through your approach to mixing and mastering?
Yeah, sure. Just let me put the jammy down real quick so I can get a little closer, more intimate with the Ableton project in front of me. All right. So in terms of mixing for this track, I wasn't thinking much except in terms of just because I actually usually when I mix, I'll go through a final stage where I turn all the volumes down, rebalance everything, all of that. I didn't actually go through that with this. I kind of just set things where I wanted to set them. But in terms of my general idea of and my general mindset is I like to make sure everything kind of has its own distinct place, both in kind of like the virtual sound space in terms of like panning and also in terms of like equalization and further creating separate spaces by making sure certain instruments only live within a certain frequency range. So you can kind of see a little bit of that with what I was talking about with the bass, because if we go to this bass sound, the EQ here is high passing all of the low frequencies right here so that it doesn't conflict with the sub bass, and it's also being high cut a bit so it doesn't conflict with any of those hi hats or any of those the white noise here or those cool synths, which I called drop circle synths for some reason. I don't know why I called them circle synths, but it's all good. How I named it is how I named it. But in terms of like general ideas when I'm mixing, that's kind of what I do. I try not to make things too complicated. For example, this drum rack here looks like the only things that are, there's 4 effects. The only things that actually matter, because these are just compression for sidechain compression, but it's basically just an EQ and a compressor. The EQ is kind of giving its own space. The compressor is just kind of gluing everything together, giving it its own just feeling and kind of just helping to bring up the overall hype and level. So combine that with, even on the kick, I have no processing. Snares, no processing. Literally nothing done here. I probably should have high passed the snares, but I didn't do that and it still sounded fine. So I would say the big thing that really helps glue this mix together and make it sound a lot larger than life would be this mastering thing I have on here, the TRS the T-Rack S1. It's kind of like a mastering processor in some ways, and it's kind of doing a lot of compression and a couple other things at once. But the best way to hear the difference it makes is just to turn it on and off. So if we play through without it on, this is what the entire thing sounds like. It's also a bit quieter right now because it does increase the level, but as you could hear, it kind of just lacks life and energy. It doesn't, even though it still like sounds fine, it doesn't really have that full vibey, dancey energy you're looking for. But you turn this on, it just brings all the quiet parts out because it's just compressing the hell out of everything. And it's also adding, by the looks of it, I just turned the focus and the air up a bit, so that's basically an EQ turning up the higher frequencies in kind of like the 1K range a little bit. Adjusting the width here so that the mix sounds a little bit wider. Turning the transients up a little bit so the drums hit a little harder, the bass punch a little bit so the bass hits a little harder. Analog just gives it a little bit of analog flavor, I guess, in this case. Basically just giving it a little more oomph in a lot of different areas to make the overall track just hit harder. So
really cool. Yeah, so thank you so much for walking us through this track. It's an amazing track, and we still are looking for everyone's comments on as to what this track should be named. You guys should give us some ideas for that. And also, like, one of the things that you brought up in the conversation was about the other track that you made using the Jammy. Can you just tell the story real quick so we can tease like the tease the thing?
Yeah, so I was working on some college audition pieces earlier this year, a lot of which I was auditioning for colleges based around live performance via electronic gear. And the Jammy has been kind of like a key aspect of my performance, this performance setup that I've made. And so I kind of created this idea for a track. I guess the entire track was centered around the idea of capturing feelings. So for example, the feeling I used for this track was I get this kind of certain feeling in me whenever I'm like driving in the middle of nowhere and then you're suddenly going into a metropolis area at night, and all of a sudden you go from this darkness and suddenly surrounded by this light everywhere all around you, and it's just like, wow, like that there's this weird feeling in my gut that you just can't really explain. And so I was attempting to explain that with the track, and I created this really cool live performance version of the track. It's called Capture a Feeling. It has not yet been released, and it might be a performance only thing, but I will probably publish a performance of that sometime soon. It also combines more than just the Jammy, so it's combining Ableton with the Jammy with a launch pad here, which I use to trigger clips and everything. So it's kind of just doing a lot of things at the same time.
Did I get it right? Is that's the track that got you admitted to the college?
Yeah, that is the general thing that got me admitted to Berkeley. So yes.
Wow, this is really cool. All right, man. Thank you so much, Ben, for walking us through this project. Have a great day.
Thank you for having me. It's been a really, really fun time doing this. So yeah, I had a great time. And thank you all for watching.
I hope that you enjoyed this breakdown of Ben's track. Don't hesitate to comment with your ideas on how to name it. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, let us know what music genres you're interested in and what software you're using. Thank you for watching. Stay creative.